We'll get started pretty soon. And those of you who don't know me, which I don't think there's very many of you, I'm Mike Jackson. I'm sort of a high school teacher. I'm in the process of retiring. I've been teaching science for 33 years or so. And but I also do a lot of work as a naturalist for a local Victoria company, Maple Leaf Adventures. And also I work for Lindblad National Geographic doing trips up in the Arctic and Antarctic and other fun places. And I spend a lot of time interpreting the land, the ocean, and very especially the intertidal zone. The intertidal zone, I think, is one of the nastiest some nastiest places on Earth to live. You'll see why later, because it's a really tough environment. For those of you who are tech inclined, I put some QR codes up here. If you know what those are, then you know what to do with them. If you don't know what they are, don't worry. But basically, you should be able to just hold your phone up to that, scan it, and up comes the link on your phone. And you have the presentation handy. However, I've also given you a paper copy of the resources. And at the very bottom, there is a short code link, which takes you to a copy of the presentation. So if you want to review the presentation later, it's all there online. So, why are we here? I just put it online. Okay.
Dim the lights, Mike.
Do we need to dim the lights?
Just
a little bit, but we have a new projector and it's nice and bright.
Yeah.
Maybe
we don't need too much stuff.
Okay, well, I don't mind. So, just a bit of an outline of what I'm hoping to do here. A little bit about how tides work, because I think it's important to understand how the patterns go. And then a little bit about the intertidal zonation, and then some species that live in the intertidal zone, and then a little bit about some of the edible stuff on the shoreline, and maybe some stuff that should not be eaten, and then a quick review of some of the resources. So a quick question, how many of you have been on one of the intertidal paddles with me? I think there's a few of you who have been on intertidal paddles. Okay, so we've done club intertidal paddles, usually in May or so, or June, when we get really nice low midday tides. And they're fun and we get to explore. So, a little bit about tides and how they work. This is a picture of a place with reasonably high tides. It's not one of the world's highest tides. This is up in Anchorage with about a 42-foot tide range. So from highest high to lowest low is about 40-something feet. It might actually be slightly bigger than that because the Americans go negative as well. More on that later. Probably the most famous place for tides in the world is, how many of you have been here? Yeah, very cool spot. This is called Hopewell Rocks in New Brunswick, and it's an amazing thing to do. This is actually not even low tide, this picture. But you can come down here at low tide, walk out, way out there, come back, walk around for a few hours, and then you can come back in a kayak a few hours later and be kayaking up amongst these trees here. And because that's the high tide level. So it's a pretty neat spot, Hopewell Rocks in Bay of Fundy, and 16 meters is pretty decent tide range. So, a little bit about the patterns, and I'm going to begin by a trick question. How long does it take the Earth to spin on its axis?
23 hours, 56 minutes.
Was not a trick question after all. It is 23 hours and 56 minutes. So why is it 23 hours and 56 minutes and not 24?
That's what it is.
You could just say it's just because Roger said so. What is the Earth doing every day as well as spinning?
Orbiting the sun.
It's orbiting the sun, and 4 minutes just happens to be about 1/365th of a day. 4 minutes, right? So what I want you to think about, and this is what happens in a day. If I was spinning on my axis and not revolving, that would be the time it takes me to revolve. But if I am revolving around the sun, You see it's a different, I have to move further to catch up. And that's why the moon does the same thing.
What about a leap year?
Nothing to do with a leap year. The leap year is simply because weeks, days, hours, minutes, and years don't add up. The actual length of the year is 365.2422 mean solar days, which is not 365 and a quarter, which is why you have leap years every 4 years except for some. Right? You guys remember a year we did, a 4 year that we didn't? Yeah, so there, 2000. Yeah, the year 2000 didn't have a leap year because it was divisible by 400. Anyway, it's a mess. And basically, the guy who was employed by Pope Gregory came up with this plan that basically made the math add up. And that's why we have leap years every 4 years except for some. It's just because months, the period of time it takes the moon to go round, the earth to go round, and the earth to go around the sun they don't have any common multiple.
So we digress.
Yes, we do digress, but we have time to digress. So, in the case of the Earth spins in 24 hours. But what is the moon doing while the Earth is spinning? It's orbiting around the Earth. And it's orbited roughly a 28th of its orbit in one day. A 28th of a day is roughly how many minutes? About 50 minutes. Which is why a tidal day, which is primarily determined by the moon, is 24 hours and 50 minutes. And that's why the tide patterns always are 50 minutes later every day. So if you've got a high tide right now today, tomorrow it'll be 50 minutes later, pretty close. So when you're on a trip, if you remembered that it was high tide at noon yesterday, it's going to be just before 1 today. So that's a handy thing to remember. Anyway, so this 24 hours and 50 minutes is called a tidal day, as opposed to a mean solar day, which is 24 hours, or the sidereal day, which is 23 hours and 56 minutes. Anyway, so there are a bunch of different tide patterns. The most common is called semi-diurnal, which means you get 2 highs and 2 lows every day. There are a few places in the world where there's basically only 1 tide a day. 1 high, 1 low. And there are also a whole bunch of places that have what we call mixed tides, where it's kind of in between the two. You'll see what I mean by that in a minute. And I've already mentioned Bay of Fundy and Ungava Bay, which is just to the right, or just to the east of Hudson's Bay, also has really, really big tides. So, I've got a couple of graphs here just to kind of blind you with science, but 24.8 is what? It's 24 hours and 50 minutes-ish. So that's a what day? That's a tidal day. So in a semi-diurnal, you basically have 2 highs, 2 lows in 1 tidal day. In a diurnal day, or a diurnal tide, you basically have 1 high, 1 low in one of those days. And something that we're probably much more familiar with is a mixed tide, where you have still 2 highs and 2 lows, but they are quite what? And these go by really great names. There is a high high and a low high, a low low and a high low. So, next slide is, guess where? Victoria. And today is Monday, so we are right about here. Okay, so I put this slide in when I was working on the presentation on, I guess, Saturday. And you can see Victoria's pattern is pretty messed up, but it's kind of mixed, bordering on diurnal. This blip here is almost absent. And there are times of the year and times of some months that Victoria really only has 1 high and 1 low. Many of you may have noticed in the last month or so, it's been kind of high tide all day, and that's kind of what's happening. So, that's Victoria, and for comparison, same time same time range, that's Bamfield. So just a couple hours down the coast, Bamfield has, it is definitely mixed. So they're higher and lower, but it's very clearly two obvious tides. So I wanted you to see here, where the point of showing you these is that tides in places that are quite close to each other can be really different. And this is another program. This is called J-Tides, and there's a link to it or on the handout. And this is a program that works on both Mac and PC. I just wanted to show you the output. It's kind of pretty. And it shows you Bamfield. And this is now Bamfield showing you 7 days. So what do you see happening in Bamfield over those 7 days? So, we're getting still 2 highs and 2 lows each day, but what's happening as I go along here? The tide range is getting bigger and bigger every day. Does anybody remember looking at that white thing in the sky a few nights ago? It's moving towards full, but a few nights ago, actually pretty much when I did this presentation, or put this presentation together, it was exactly half. Okay? And by whenever this is, which is probably going to be next Friday or Saturday, it's going to be full. And so you can see some things happening there. And just for comparison, you can see Victoria, weird place. This was Saturday's tide in Victoria, and you can see that it gets slightly more, almost normal looking, but it's still pretty messed up. And just to show you a month at a time, and this is from a textbook that I used to use, a whole month in a whole bunch of different places on BC. So we've got Prince Rupert and Alert Bay, which have pretty much what I would call normal tides. Point Atkinson, near Vancouver, pretty weird. Victoria, really weird. Tofino, getting back to kind of normal, right? So Tofino, Bamfield, pretty much what I call the normal tide patterns, and then these two have really weird ones. Where are these guys relative to these guys? They're in kind of inland waters, right? And when you start looking at Puget Sound, Strait of Georgia, you've got all these different bodies of water emptying and flushing into each other, and that kind of messes up the tides. Whereas places like Prince Rupert and Tofino are more open and get more normal tides. But on this graph, you can also see, what can you say about the tides over here, and over there? Well, the range. They're much, much bigger at those 3 points. And here, they are much, much smaller. So we have smaller range tides and larger range tides. You'll also notice that they put some astronomy legend down here: full moon, new moon, full moon, and the 2 quarters. So what can you notice about the correlation between the moon phases and the tides? When the moon is full or new, you get bigger tides. What are those tides called? Spring tides. And it's not called spring tide to do with any season, it's called spring tide because of the German sprungen, to leap. Okay? And I don't remember what neap means, but I have a feeling it's something that's not leaping. But neaps are the quarter phases. So when you have a half moon, you get a neap tide. And all a spring tide and a neap tide means is big range versus smaller range. So, the patterns, so we can see that there's spring and neap tides, and you can also see that there's an inequality sometimes, right? There's the high-low, sorry, the high-high and the low-high, the low-low and the high-low, and that difference changes over a month as well, which is kind of weird, and we'll see why later. I'm going to see if this works in here. I thought I connected to the internet, and I have no idea if it's going to work. Okay, so it's showing you. Okay, I have to. It's showing really nicely on my computer, but not on that screen. So I'll try that later. So basically, how tides are generated is a combination of two forces. Gravity, which is kind of the more familiar thing, and what two factors does gravity depend on? Mass and distance. And so a guy by the name of Isaac Newton came up with a universal law of gravitation, which he basically said it's the product of the masses. So if you've got two really big masses, you've got really big forces. If you've got two really small masses, you've got really smaller forces. But there is a gravitational attraction between every two objects in the universe. Okay? The other side of the coin is that it's an inverse square. What that means is if I go twice as far away, what have I done to the size? I've quartered it. If I go 3 times as far away, I've ninethed it. If I go 4 times as far away, I've 16thed it. So basically, the further you go away, it gets kind of exponentially smaller. So to get a big tide force, what do you want? You want big things close together. Okay, that's really what he said. The other thing, and this is the really messy bit, is the moon isn't just orbiting around the Earth. The Earth and moon are orbiting around their common geocenter. So if you think of 2 ice skaters on a rink that are the same size, and they start going and spin, they will spin around their hands. But if one was really, really big and the other one was really small, what would you see? You'd see kind of a weird spirograph kind of pattern because they're spinning around their common center, which would actually be probably inside the big person. And so the same thing happens with the Earth and the moon. The Earth and the moon are spinning around their common center. And so the net effect of that is that there is a centripetal force that is lesser on the back side of the Earth than it is on the front side. And so on the front side, you basically get the gravitational attraction. On the back side, you're kind of getting the result of the spin. The bottom line is you don't have to understand the physics. You need to realize that there are always 2 bulges due to the moon. Does that make sense? There's one facing the moon and one facing away from the moon. We call the one facing the moon the direct tide, and the one that's on the other side the indirect. And the tides don't move around the Earth. What's actually happening is that the Earth is spinning inside the bulge. Does that make sense? Because the moon's creating this bulge, and the Earth is spinning inside it. And so if you're on the Earth, you spin through how many bulges a day? 2. And that's why you get, in most places in the world, 2 highs and 2 lows in a day. Does that kind of make sense? The indirect and the direct give you those 2 tides. Now I've got a beautiful diagram here that is really nasty physics with FG and FC and all kinds of vector arrows, which you can ignore. But the key thing to notice is you got the moon over here, go up to scale, bulge on this side, bulge on that side, and the 2 bulges are actually about the same size. So that's kind of how the moon creates a tide. But the other thing that a lot of people don't realize is that the sun is almost as important as, well, not almost, it's 46% as important as the moon. Which means that if the sun's effect is almost half of the moon, it's like a third moon, 2/3 moon, 1/3 sun. if the sun and the moon are working together, you're going to get what kind of a tide? You're going to get a big tide or a spring tide. If they're working at cross purposes, you're going to get a smaller tide or a neap tide. So there's kind of a diagram showing you this is what phase?
Spring.
Or it's going to give you a spring tide, but what moon phase would this be? If this is right on the, this is a new moon, this will give you an eclipse, solar eclipse, right, Roger?
Yes.
Solar eclipse. We watched a solar eclipse last year from the same place in Utah. So here, this is new moon and full moon. This is where you get a lunar eclipse, if the moon gets completely in the shadow. So those are the two things where the sun's forces and the moon's forces are in the same plane. I'm going to go and see here if I can, and I shall do this one, neap tides. And so here, the idea is that the moon is still winning, but the sun is kind of making the net effect smaller. Is that going to make sense as to why we get springs and neaps and why they're at those phases? Now, I'm just going to try something here and see if I can get this to work again. Okay, let's see if I can. Okay, so if my YouTube thing works, I can find where my mouse is. This is a kind of a simulation where you can see the moon orbiting the Earth. And can you see that the size and shape of the bulge changes with essentially the position of the moon relative to the sun? And then you go to all the ads. Okay. It always happens. There we go. So close that. Mouse back. Where's my mouse? Okay, so we're back to here. So, we've kind of explained two bulges, two tides every day, and springs and neaps. But the other thing that's weird is that the Earth's orbit around the sun and the moon's orbit around the Earth are not circular. They're elliptical, and they do vary quite a bit. The moon changes from just over 350,000 kilometers to over 400,000 kilometers, which is a pretty big change. And we call those perigee and apogee. You may have heard of those terms before. And what's going to happen when the moon is further away? Less force, exactly. So my next question is, when is the Earth closest to the sun? And you can't answer this one, Roger. No, you can't. I said you can't answer this one. Oh, you got it wrong.
June and
About January 2nd, 3rd, or 4th every year. When is it at its closest? Sorry, when is it at its furthest? When is the Earth furthest from the sun? 6 months from then, in about July 2nd, 3rd, or 4th, which is why the Americans celebrate July 4th, isn't it? No, so that's called, we talk about perihelion and aphelion. Peri is Greek for close, ap means far, so we have perigee, apogee. Anyway, so the distance to the sun, does that make any obvious effect on seasons? No, because our summer and the southern summer are happening at 6 months apart. So the distance to the sun does not change the seasons. If the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere were equally covered in land, which they aren't, very much aren't, then southern hemisphere summers would be slightly hotter than northern hemisphere summers, but they're not, because there's a lot of blue stuff down there. Okay, so the sun also has this elliptical orbit, and you can kind of see that whole thing here, 91 to 94 million miles, not quite as much of a percentage difference. But I then ask you, what combination is going to give you the biggest possible tides now?
And the sun and moon are both.
Sun and moon are both aligned, and the sun is as close as it can be, and the moon is as close as it can be. What do we call it when that thing happens? And it usually happens around when in the year? Usually around, it's got to happen around January 2nd. And that's a king tide. Exactly. So I'm sure you've all heard of king tides, and they tend to happen when you get a full or new moon around January 2nd, and if the moon happens to be at perigee, then that's going to be a much bigger king tide. So, all right, so, and the last little thing I want to explain is this kind of high highs and low highs, and high lows and low lows. So, the moon isn't on exactly the same plane as the Earth. Sometimes it's north of the equator, sometimes it's south of the equator, sometimes it's bang on, and when it is bang on, we get an eclipse. But most of the time the moon actually misses, the moon's shadow or the Earth's shadow miss each other. And this fact that the moon is sometimes north of the equator and sometimes south of the equator is why we get a lopsided bulge, which means if you're in the northern hemisphere, one bulge is bigger than the other. And you'll see this in my next diagram. So, if the moon is up here to the north of the equator, the bulge is now lopsided towards the north on one side. So you can see the direct is on the north side, the indirect is on the south side. If you're up here in BC, what are you going to see during the course of one day? Remember this thing in the middle here, the Earth is spinning through the bulge. You're going to see one big tide and one small tide. And when that happens, that's when you get what we call mixed tides. So I hope in that little run through there, I've kind of given you enough understanding that we see that tides actually do vary quite a bit from place to place and from time of year to time of year and time of the month as well. So any questions so far? That's a lot of physics. And that's it for physics, yes.
What causes the single tide during the day? Parts of the world have that.
If you are in one of the places that has, it's essentially where the bulge is flat,
At the top of the earth, the bottom of it.
and also there are places where, well again, it can be shifted off the top because of the tilt, but also if you're in places where the body of water isn't big enough to have a tide, because the Earth, again, isn't this perfect blob with water on it, which is what this diagram assumes. There's these continents in the way. And so what that means is that instead of there being a bulge that sweeps all the way around the Earth, it kind of sweeps its way around an ocean. And if you've ever taken a wine glass and kind of swirled your glass of wine around, and the wave kind of scoots its way around the wine glass, that's basically what tides do around the Pacific. And they do that once every 12 hours, right? And so that line, so that's happening. What do you notice in the middle of your wine glass? The water basically doesn't move. If you're out at the edge of the wine glass, you get lots of movement. In the middle, you get virtually no movement. So that explains why some places in the middle of the Pacific have virtually no tides, and other places have much, much bigger tides. The places with single tides often basically have what I call weird geography, like Victoria, Vancouver. They're surrounded by bodies of water that get confusing. So, okay, so on to tidal life now. And I'm sure you've all noticed that we have a zonation of life on the shore. And basically that zonation is depending on how much drying, how much wetting there is. If you've got basically virtually never splashed, we call it the splash zone, or if you want to be fancy, the supralittoral. Littoral meaning beachy in Latin, and supra meaning way high. And then we have the tide zone, which is the high tide zone, which is only really covered during the high tides of the which tides? The springs. And then you have the middle zone, which is basically covered and uncovered every day. So the organisms that live here have to be able to survive extended periods with no water coverage. These guys basically get covered and uncovered every day. These guys only get uncovered during what kind of tides? The springs, because remember the neaps, the low gets higher and the high gets lower for a smaller range in the middle. So that's kind of how biologists or ecologists have divided the intertidal zone. And I've got a few diagrams here, which are probably going to be really hard to see, but this is kind of the whole ocean. And if any of you have ever watched Finding Nemo with kids or grandkids, there's all the epipelagic, mesopelagic, bathypelagic, so all these pelagic zones. And then if we zoom right in here, this little spot here, this is our tide zone with the splash zone, high tide, middle and low tide zones. And this is a diagram that I found, and it's kind of hard to see because it's the best I could get. But basically from here out is called subtidal. That's where Roger spends all his time, right, diving. And in between here and here is our tidal zone. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Americans and Canadians are different in how they measure tides. Remember I said that they go negative? The Americans measure the low tide datum, or datum as they call it, from an average low tide, which means you actually get an awful lot of tides that are negative, about half of them. Does that make sense? Whereas Canadians measure their tides from the lowest normal tide, which means to get a negative tide in Canada, you have to have a basically really strong spring tide with a perihelion or a perigee or something like that happening at the same time. So basically Canadian low tides are lower than American ones. Or the Canadian tide datum is lower, and so it's important actually if you're looking at charts and you're moving from one to another, they're measuring from different places.
So how do programs like Navigon handle that? Do they give a different number for the ones and they look for the...
Depends on where they're getting their data from, but I think most people are getting their data from a thing called the X-Tide database, and they've taken all that into account. But you can sometimes get American data for Canadian sites, and that only works on American charts for Canadian sites, not Canadian charts for Canadian sites. Does that make sense? It's like, if you go to the Victoria Tide Table, that's made by the Canadian Hydrographic Service. It's for Victoria, and it's based on the Canadian data. But if you were to get an American tide station that was, they would say it's like based on, say, Port Angeles or something like that, and then they would extrapolate what they think Victoria should be, then it would be based on the American data, and not correct for us. Yeah.
So is that, like metric, is that Americans the only ones that are still going to step with that, or do other countries that do that as well?
I don't know. Yeah, it could well be. So, and then you'll notice that up above the high tide zone, there's a group of organisms that I'll talk about later, but I consider them to actually be part of the intertidal zone. And then eventually you do get into forests, and here you're definitely back at the tide zone. And I'm sure all of you have noticed that there's a range of different stuff on the tides. And up in the higher area, there's often not very much stuff, though if you look closely, there's a lot more than you think. And there's kind of periwinkles, I'll show you what those are, and barnacles, there are more mussels and barnacles and seaweeds, and down below you get lots of seaweeds and lots of cool stuff, which is why it's fun to go out in a nice spring tide. And down here you can again see the diversity keeps on getting more as you go further down. You get sponges and slugs and sea stars and all kinds of weeds. And the other thing here is that things up at the top are pretty much all shelled. Right? A lot of the things that are living up in the high tide zone are shelled. Okay, so I think that's basically a different version of the same slide. And this is a real version of the same thing. So what do you notice? This is going to be sea stars from a few years ago, lots of anemones. That would be the low tide zone, right? Somewhere around here, mid tide zone, upper high tide zone, and then up here we're getting into the splash zone because it's got the orange lichen. And then in some cases the black lichen, and then just another picture showing you, again, that tidal zonation. This is the east coast. Pretty much the same kind of thing, slightly different species, but still it's zoned. And so anywhere you go in the world, the tidal zones will be zoned. In the Galapagos, they're zoned. Okay, and again, same thing. This graph is kind of cool. It shows you, depending on where you are in the tide zone, how many hours a month you either spend in the air or submerged. If you are up in the higher tide zone up here, you're getting 600 hours plus a month out of the water. Whereas down here, you're only having to spend 100 hours a month out of the water. So it's a big difference as to how much you're spending out of the water. And if you're at the mean sea level, you're covered 40, or you're out 40% of the time. And why does it suck to be living in the tide zone? Because you are exposed to all these really nasty environmental factors. Desiccation, drying, altered salinity. What is this picture trying to tell you? You can be in salt water or you can be in fresh water. And biologically, any of you who've played with cells and stuff in the lab know that they do very different things from osmotically process. So it can be really hard for animals to live in both fresh and saltwater environments. In fact, we're all familiar with salmon. What do they do before they go up a river? Well, they stop eating, but they hang around in the estuary for often a period of several weeks while they allow their physiology to adjust to be able to get up the river. Now, there are predators, which could be human or they could be oyster catchers. What's this one here talking about? Why is that picture? For them, they can only feed when they're underwater, and the poor barnacles get very little water time, right? And up here, it's just showing you a graph of temperatures in some tide zones. They can be extreme. I was doing some research on marine iguanas in Galapagos many years ago. We actually measured 50 degrees Celsius on the lava surface in the intertidal zone. The thermometer sitting on the rocks was measuring 50 Celsius. And then when the water comes over them, it could get as low as 16 Celsius. Here, it can go to, on our coast, it could get -5, maybe. Does it ever get much colder than that here? Yeah. And then, yeah?
Is climate change impacting this? Imagine thermal expansion just
Yes, so
moving this up.
So climate change is gradually causing the mean sea level to rise, and so tidal zones are changing. But it's changing pretty slowly, so I think that when you're looking at millimeters or centimeters per decade versus a 5-meter tide range, it's pretty easy for that whole thing to kind of gradually move from one year to the next, if that makes sense.
The other threat would be storm surges.
Yeah. Yeah, and the storm surges are going to be even bigger, yeah.
How are the barnacles coping with pH change?
So pH change, I don't know the specific answer to that one for barnacles. I know that many species are suffering because of the calcium equilibrium with acids in the water. I don't know the specifics for barnacles. Anyway, so it's a tough life out there in the intertidal zone. So that's kind of all my general stuff about kind of the background of the intertidal zone. Don, sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted in comparison, looking at our coast here, Canada on our coast here, compared to where I grew up in the south shore of Nova Scotia. there's a huge, like we've got up-teen times as much life as we do along the coast of Nova Scotia on the south shore, which is a very rocky coastline. There's hardly anything living along the shoreline, even in the tidal zone, in comparison to here. And I'm wondering if that doesn't have something to do with the tidal differences, because there the tides, you know, every day they were almost the same, just obviously based on the moon. You had periods where you had, like they I think had the tides were more comparable. They didn't have that little blip tide that we have here in between high and low.
There are places there that do, so it,
Yeah, well, certainly on the other side, on the Fundy side, it's very, very different. And I'm wondering why there would be such a difference in the extent of life forms on the intertidal zone between the two
Yeah.
coasts.
you know, I don't know the answer to that. The thing I do know, though, is that the shore from Alaska to California is probably the richest intertidal zone in the world. We live in some of the best intertidal in the world. There's very few places that have tidal zones that are much more diverse than here. And why that is, I don't exactly know, but I think it could be to do with a pretty decent range that we have here over much of it. But I'm sure there's other
Over
factors.
some upwellings from the Pacific as well, certainly
Yeah.
here.
So, what am I looking at? I'm looking at the splash zone, and you'll notice here the orange lichen. Let me know where I am in that picture.
Looks like down California.
No, not too far away.
10 mile place?
Let me know where I like to go paddle a lot.
Chatham? Chatham?
It's Chatham Island. Yeah, it's that little flip where all the herons hang out in Chatham Island. But anyway, high tide, and we're just seeing the splash zone. And I couldn't get a clear picture, but looking down below, you could see periwinkles and limpets just below the water surface there. And there's kind of more of the same. So I view this zone here as still part of the intertidal because it is affected by the ocean. In some places, on this coast here, it's an orange zone and a white zone, but in other places, there's a black zone. And these lichens are very salt-tolerant lichens. And a lichen is a symbiosis of an alga and a fungus that are able to be pretty tough. The other good thing that I like when I see this is lichens are a really good indicator of pollution. So if we can see lots of lichens here, that means we have very little air pollution. Basically, if there's air pollution, lichens just die. And in fact, in much of industrial Britain, lichens pretty much disappeared on the trunks of all trees.
Lifestyle or not, the more jellyfish, the more polluted the water is?
Okay, so splash zone. So the pictures I'm going to show you, or many of the slides that I'm going to show you now, are from a presentation from a chap called Tim Hall, who put this together for Rosario Beach. Let me know where Rosario Beach is. It's not in Canada, but it's actually straight across.
Orcas, isn't it?
It's actually right around the corner from Deception Pass. So it's right on the mainland, just outside of Deception Pass, but basically the same species as we have here. So splash zone, I would say, this is sort of exactly where does the splash zone begin and where does the high tide zone stop is, I'm sure if you had like 10 tide studiers, they'd all disagree. But it's, for me, the lichens are definitely in the splash zone. The barnacles and the periwinkles are the high tide or splash zone, but anyway. The little brown barnacles are typically the highest of the barnacles, and you occasionally get some sea lettuce, though sea lettuce is often a bit further down, and we get quite a lot of limpets. And periwinkles. How big are periwinkles? Really, really small. In fact, when you're generally walking around, you don't even notice they're there. They're these little tiny things that are about 1 to 2 millimeters across, and there's usually lots and lots of them. In Europe, they grow quite a bit bigger, different species, and you can go and buy a bag of winkles. And then you eat them fresh. So, a little bit about lifestyle periwinkles. How do these darn things live? Because what's growing there? The rock is covered with this film of algae. And the periwinkles are primarily going around at night, but again, they are going around and they're using their tongue. And this is an electron micrograph of the tongue of a periwinkle. And you can see it's basically this raspy kind of file that is scraping stuff off the rocks. And I can't remember what the word winkle means, but there's periwinkles, and then there's dog winkles. And anyway, so things that eat them, these guys, and you can see sometimes they'll have these gelatinous egg masses, and these little tiny periwinkles often can live for 5 to 10 years. So they're actually quite long-lived little critters, and they're very hardy. And many of you may have seen their shells, especially the larger ones, getting used by hermit crabs. And here's just a sample of the color patterns. You can see all kinds of different color patterns, from almost pure dark to pure white, and checkered in the middle. They often like to hang around or hide in holes in the rock. And so here you can see a bunch of periwinkles, and there you can see a barnacle got going in that hole. And the high tide zone, to me, is really kind of hard to tell the difference between the high tide and the splash zone. It's just more of the same. You get a lot more periwinkles, more limpets, and more barnacles, and more species. So there's a few more species. And there's a few more seaweeds that start happening there. Probably for us, the most common one is rockweed. What do you know if you see rockweed in the water in front of you?
There's a rock underneath.
There's a rock underneath it, and it's probably just about at the level that you will hit it. And this one here is kind of cool. Mastocarpus, or Turkish towel. Many of you may have seen it. It's the very rough, knobbly seaweed. It's a reddish seaweed. But this black blob that you probably have also seen on the rocks is the same species. Its algae go through a thing called an alternation of generations, where the two halves of the life cycle are very, very different. And so you can either say that this is babies of these, or these are babies of those. It's the whole chicken and egg thing, but those are both Turkish towel. The black thing is called sea tar, because it looks like a blob of tar on the rocks. Porphyra is a red algae. It's actually edible. Green tuft is edible. Sea moss is edible. Rockweed is edible, but totally non-nutritious. And then some of the intertidal life. You'll notice that there are now lots of different kinds of winkles. We have striped dog winkles and channeled dog winkles. My favorite one is a thing called the leafy hornmouth, which is just a very cool name, and it's a predator of barnacles. So we've got shield limpets, haystack barnacles, finger limpets. So you're starting to see just more kinds of the same. So you're still seeing limpets and stuff like that, but there's just more species as you get further and further down, and more numbers. So, what do you think the advantage of living way high up is? Because there's obviously disadvantages because you never get any food. It's more predictable, but basically, the further up you are, the less likely something is going to come and eat you from the ocean. And so these guys here, the dog winkles, the hornmouth, and all of these are predators. They will eat periwinkles, they'll eat barnacles. But if you're a barnacle and you're too high out of the water, they don't get to them. In fact, you'll often see kind of a line on the shoreline that marks basically this is how far the winkles go. And they just won't get out any further.
So the winkles eat the barnacles?
Yes.
Okay.
So these guys here, the dog winkles, are their predatory snails, whereas the periwinkles are herbivorous snails. They're eating algae. And there's just a bit of high tide zone with some nice limpets. And what I think is also cool about the intertidal zone and everywhere in the ocean is everything grows on everything. And basically, if you've been around for if you've ever put a boat in the water and left it there, or a mooring buoy, whatever, it gets covered in weeks in the summer. And you can get a really good view here of the barnacle trapdoors, as I call them. And that's basically how they shut up shop until they get covered again, right? It's a nice seal that is a reasonable protection against predators, but also against drying out.
What's the finger-like thing in the center?
The limpet?
That's a limpet?
Yeah, this is a finger limpet.
Oh.
Now, do the oyster catchers, is this what they're eating?
Amongst other things, they will try and eat limpets, yes. They'll eat, basically oyster catchers will eat most things that aren't oysters. In the intertidal zone. But they basically, if you've ever looked at their beaks, they're kind of orange carrots, but if you look at them sideways, they're almost like a little knife. They're almost like a blade that they can insert. So they kind of insert their blade sideways, and they can lift limpets off, and chitons and other things. So that's the high tide zone. And so remember that this zone here is basically only getting covered when? During the highest tide, so during the spring tides. So it can spend days uncovered. So things that live there are able to survive for days without being in the water. And the mid-tide zone is what I think of as the true kind of intertidal zone. You've got barnacles, rockweed, mussels, and more. And let's take a look at some of the species. There's at least 35 species of plants that grow around our intertidal zone, or I should say algae. There's green rope, there's sea cauliflower, and sea this, and black pine, and it looks nothing like pine, and sea lace that isn't really lacy. And anyway, jumping back a bit, though, there are three major groups of seaweeds. Any idea what they are? It's on the slide.
Red, green, brown.
Red, green, and brown. And those are the three major phylogenetic subdivisions of the algae and seaweeds. The rhodophyta, the phaeophyta, and I forgot what the other one is. But anyway, they are essentially red seaweeds, green seaweeds, and brown seaweeds. A general guide is that green and red algae are edible and nutritious. Brown algae are edible and not nutritious, because the sugars, or I should say the carbohydrates in brown algae are not digestible. Case in point, in the Galapagos, the marine iguanas like to feed on sea lettuce, the same sea lettuce that we get here. In fact, that's their kind of primary diet. During an El Nino, all the sea lettuce dies because the water temperature goes up too high. There's lots of brown seaweed. The marine iguanas eat the brown seaweed, but they die with full stomachs because they can't digest seaweed, and they get up to 80% mortality during an El Nino year because of not being able to digest the brown seaweed, even though they eat it because they have nothing else. But the brown algae, so if you get, for example, bull kelp makes great pickles. You can take the tubes of the bull kelp, wash it off in the spring, pickle it, and there's nice little crunchy pickles. But they have no nutritional value. They're just nice and crunchy, and they taste of vinegar, which is kind of like, same with chips, right? But the key thing is that there's very little nutritive value in the brown seaweeds. What else? Okay, on to some animals. These are starting to be some more familiar guys. So lots of crabs, and more of those later. Lots of sea stars, or starfish as people like to call them. What is the name of that one? I'm sure we'll go.
Ochre.
That's the ochre star, most of which are not ochre. They're purple, around here anyway. And they have basically almost disappeared due to the sea star wasting disease. There is definite signs that they are recovering. The aggregating anemone is probably one of the most common intertidal anemones. And it has that little pink center that's kind of cool. What's also kind of cool is that the green around the outside is a symbiotic algae. They can actually, if the temperatures go all wonky, they can lose their green because the algae leave them. And they end up being white with pink centers. At which point they don't do so well because they're actually getting food, sugars from the green algae. And the green algae are getting a place to live. But that's the aggregating anemone. And then chitons, there are dozens of species of chitons around the shoreline here. And that one here is the black katy, is one of my favorites. We have, the other favorite I have is the gumboot chiton, which you can get about this big. Anyway, so the low tide zone is quite hard to see, and it's not often uncovered. Lots of diversity, so you have to plan a visit to the low tide zone by looking way ahead at the tide charts. And Jenny, and I guess now Gary, has to look at the things and say, okay, these are possible days, and then he has to find me and Dave and say, can you do any of these days, and so on. Because we want a low tide that's not too early, not too late. It's got to be kind of 11 till 1, and it's got to be a nice low tide. So there's only a certain number of days in the year that works. And it does have a rich combination of both intertidal. Many of the low tide species are also found subtidal. So is everybody okay with subtidal, meaning below the low tide?
Mike, one of the things I've noticed, especially North Island, where there's very rocky or cliffs that face north, but never get any direct sunlight. And it seems to me that there's a much more diverse and interesting set of life in that intertidal zone, because they never get sun, and if you can kayak along there, it's just like a wall of
Yeah,
joy
kayaking around the
watching.
Broughton's or anywhere up there in
Yeah,
low tide is just
Yeah.
phenomenal.
Yeah, and
That's where you see lots of the leafy hornmouths and
so
lots of
is that
dogwoods.
because they're not getting any sun, so they can,
Well, I think it's actually,
more can survive there?
what you're seeing is that because there's less sun, I think there's actually more animal life, and there's nothing getting baked there. So there's no kind of, the desiccation is not so much of an issue, but the animals that are coating, like, so all of these barnacles, like almost everything that's living in the upper tide zone is actually an animal, right? And they're feeding off what? Well, the periwinkles are feeding off algae, but just about everything else is feeding off the plankton. And if you look at if you take a glass of salt water and look at it under a microscope, it's just crawling with little critters. Some of those are baby barnacles and baby crabs and baby this, that, and the other, but some of them are things called copepods and other stuff, but those form the food for just about everything in the intertidal zone. Pretty much everything that lives in the intertidal zone as an animal is a filter feeder of some form. So some of the algae here, you'll see this thing here, also I think sometimes called dead man's fingers. It's kind of like these floppy green things that are kind of gross. Feather boa is a cool one that we have around a lot of our coast. Has a long center stem and then all the little feathers coming off it. The winged kelp and the seersucker. And of course bull kelp. And you also get a lot of these coralline algae, and they look pink and they're actually very hard. And they've actually got calcium carbonate built into or embedded into their structure. Okay, so that's kind of covered the zones. So let's look at a few particular species. So just showing you the variety of different barnacles that are in the intertidal zone. And these are all from Rosario Beach. You can see the little brown barnacle, you can see the acorn barnacle, and you can see the haystack barnacles that have kind of more of a thatched, look like a haystack. And then there's also, at the lower tide zone, you'll see the giant barnacles that are literally about the size of your fist. And if you go in some places that are a bit more exposed, you'll see gooseneck barnacles. Let me know where in Victoria we can easily see gooseneck barnacles.
Out past Soup, you find.
Yeah, out past Sue, but in Victoria, that Trial Island, sorry. These are really good, these. If you go around the outside of Trial Island, and also around the outside of Seabird Point by Discovery, you can see some gooseneck barnacles. They seem to be more adapted to the exposed outer coast. But here you can see something that's common to all barnacles are the things called the cirri, which are basically these feathery covered legs that when the water covers them, they put out and they sweep through the water to feed. And that's how barnacles live. So what's the most random fact about barnacles that somebody knows?
They don't eat those cookies.
They don't eat these cookies, okay?
Darwin's research.
It's sort of a Guinness Book of Records thing.
Longest tongue or something like that?
You're getting close.
Not the tongue.
It's not the tongue.
I can't remember what it is.
Siri?
Longest femijay. They have the longest penis for their size of any organism in the animal kingdom. And if you think about it, if you're a barnacle here, you fertilize the barnacle over here, you're not crawling over. You've got to have a long one. So, that's how barnacles work. Okay.
Not very romantic.
Some of the marine algae, we talked about the greens, the reds, and the browns. There's also diatoms, and if you ever looked at sort of like the lower beach at Willows or in Cabra Bay, it's often covered with kind of a brown or green scum, and that's actually diatoms. And diatoms under the microscope are incredibly beautiful. They're called diatoms because they have two shells, and they're kind of like pillboxes made out of a glassy material, and they're just, under the microscope, they're spectacular. Yeah, so the three main groups of algae have different pigments. The green have chlorophyll, which is the same as our land plants have. The reds and the browns have different pigments, but it does the same kind of thing as chlorophyll. Yeah, seaweeds, and a bunch of different sea anemones. So this is the aggregating anemone. Some of them are out, you can see here. And then giant green anemone, which surprisingly is large and green. One of my favorite ones is the Christmas anemone, because it's got the red and the green. And they're also really quite big. The rows and the brooding are all, it's called brooding because it actually reproduces by brooding off little baby anemones. They kind of, like, it's like one of those games where,
So it's budding?
they're budding off, literally, yeah. So you can see all the baby anemones are just, so as well as having sexual reproduction where they throw out their eggs and sperm and stuff into the water column, they also reproduce asexually like that. And if you ever go along docks and so on, you'll see the plumose anemone, which is also pretty spectacular.
There are also small green anemones.
Sorry?
Besides the giant green anemone, are there little ones? Are there little ones?
The smaller ones that I've seen are actually these guys here, the aggregating ones, and they're green with a pink in the middle usually. But there could be a small or a young giant green.
Okay. I've seen down at the place where the Canadian forces have their, there's a whole wall there of ones that are about this big around, and they're green.
They are most likely then the aggregating anemone. Because when the ones that form like a wall are the aggregating, and when they're all kind of sucked in to hide from the dry, you can't see the red at all. so they look completely green. And this is certainly the most common in the higher tide zones. And it's probably the most common anemones. They tend to fill lots of cracks in the rocks and so on.
Mike,
Yes.
I've seen like the aggregate, the giant, and the plumas, but where do you see the brooding, the Christmas, and the rose?
I've seen them kayaking along in the Broughtons.
Oh.
I've seen them out of Port Renfrew. I haven't been around. I mean, these guys are lower tide species, so they are. All of these species are much harder to see than these guys, which are mid-tide species. Another place to see these would be Botanical Beach.
Up in Delfino, you see a lot of the giant greens.
Yeah.
As they walk along the beaches.
Okay, a few bits of starfish stuff. So what do most starfish or sea stars eat? They like to eat clams and mussels, and if you ever see a starfish that's kind of pointing up, it's usually got a clam in the middle of its system, and they basically pry open the shell, insert their stomach, dissolve the poor sucker inside, and then leave the shell. And they eat all these guys, and they do get eaten by glaucous-winged gulls. You may have seen that happen a few times, and also red rock crabs. They can somewhat, I don't really call this asexual reproduction so much as just recovery from injury, but they can recover their limbs. Most sea stars have, how many limbs? 5, but some have an awful lot more, like the sun star, but they're usually multiples of 5. They do reproduce sexually, so they have eggs and sperm, goes out into the water column where they combine, and they form these little cool planktonic. This is basically a larval sea star in the plankton. And it has 5 little dangly things. Yeah.
Do they not eat bull kelp as well?
Starfish? No. Sea stars don't. No. Sea stars are predators only.
Okay. I'm sorry.
Most of the sea stars are
urchins.
the urchins. Yes,
Okay.
that's the next slide.
And
they do live quite. They are quite long lived.
Is there a theory of why they were absent for some time?
Well, it's been attributed to this thing called sea star wasting disease, which they think is a viral infection. They don't exactly know why the entire coast suddenly got this viral infection that hammered the sun stars, the Pycnopodium, and it hammered the ochre stars. Other stars, like leather stars, hardly seemed affected.
So
There's quite a few blood stars, didn't really.
I heard a theory that there were some canary species for nuclear sort of waste from Japan.
Yeah,
It coincided with the blog as well.
yeah, it's everything that I've heard, everything that I've read in the literature is inconclusive, and there's all kinds of theories. Yes.
I'm wondering, the regular starfish, can they move as great a distance as the sun stars? I was watching a video clip that showed them.
Sun stars are
huge
really fast.
distances,
Yeah. How many of you have seen this? The many-armed sun star. They can get really big,
Yeah.
and they can move really fast. Like you can just see them kind of. It's almost like they're a little hovercraft on the bottom of the
And
rocks.
I've seen them really recovering in the Broughtons.
Mhm.
There's lots of small
Yeah.
ones now.
Okay, a few other starfish relatives. And if you've ever looked at a sea urchin shell, you'll notice that it's divided up into 5 bits, which is part of the thing that joins all of the echinoderms, as they're called. So the purple sea urchin and the red sea urchin, and of course the green one, which is smaller. The sea cucumber, this is the orange sea cucumber. This is quite common around Victoria, though usually the only bit you see is the little orange tuft sticking out of the rocks, because that's the feeding apparatus. And the rest of it is kind of just, the rest of this body part is usually buried in amongst the rocks, or you'll see this kind of orange flower,
Yeah,
and that's the feeding tentacles of a orange sea cucumber.
cool.
This here, the Parasticopus, giant sea cucumber, or California sea cucumber. They can get pretty big. They can get this long very easily, and they are harvested, as are these. The only thing they eat in these are what? The gonads. Yep, the eggs, basically. And here, these guys have how many sets of muscles inside? 5. They're really long, thin muscles that if you've ever picked up a sea urchin, allow the thing to kind of squish up or shrink up into a little blob. But the only edible part of the sea urchin, or I should say the only worth eating part, is this little strip of muscle. And out of a large sea cucumber about this size, you might get kind of 4 tiny McDonald's fry size, 5 little skinny fries of meat out of that whole animal. So it's just not worth it. And you can see here, this is another sea cucumber that's armored, and it shows you the orange thing coming out there. Brittle stars are also found in the lower area, and brittle stars are like the regular stars, except they have this round disc in the middle, and then long skinny legs that don't get much. They don't seem to thin out as much as the other ones. So, features of the echinoderms. So the echinoderms in Latin means spiny skin. Echino. You come across echidnas in Australia? The echidna, it's a spiny animal because of the echino. And derm is the same as dermatologist. Anyway, they all have spiny skin, they all have this radial symmetry. The fancy word for it is pentaradial symmetry because they go out in 5 directions. They have these planktonic larvae, but they also have these 2 feet, and their whole locomotion and system is based on kind of a hydraulic system. They're pumping water back and forth in and out of these legs. Okay, chitons. There are so many cool chitons. And what makes a chiton is it's a mollusk, so it's relative to the snails and stuff, but it has 8 plates inside. Sometimes they're visible, as in the leather chiton, or we call this black Katy as well. The mossy and hairy, and the difference between the mossy and the hairy is one's supposed to be mossy and the other's hairy, but really they're pretty similar. As is the woody, they're all very similar. The line chiton is one that's fairly easy to see. It's got these beautiful lines on the shell. And then this one here, this is not a huge one, but it's a pretty big gumboot chiton. And the gumboot chiton, the shell pieces are all inside the body. And it still has those same 8 plates. And if you see those plates as shells, they're like little butterfly wings. Kind of cool. And most of them eat the algae and the diatoms that are on the surface. And again, seagulls, starfish, crabs are the predators. And again, they have sexual reproduction, and they have these funky little larvae that swim around in the water and make barnacle food. And many of them can live for 25 years or 20 years or more. And they are related to all the other mollusks. And the mollusks include the octopus, the snails and limpets, the mussels and clams, the chitons, and also the coolest ones, which are the sea slugs. And the sea slugs are the next picture, and we don't get to see anywhere near as many sea slugs as Roger does, right? There are so many sea slugs on this coast subtidally, but intertidally there are a handful. I've seen around Victoria on our club paddles, this one, and this one. And I've also seen one called the hooded nudibranch as well. But they are basically slugs that live in the sea, so they don't have a shell. And they're called nudibranchs because they have their branchia, their breathing gill things are uncovered and are nude. So that's these things we're seeing here. Okay, blue mussel is probably one of the most characteristic species on our coast. It's a filter feeder, so the way blue mussels feed is they just suck water in and filter it and spit it back out again, which is basically what clams do. If you've ever watched clams, I think if we do our tide walk, we usually go through in Oak Bay by the marina there, you can see there's a whole bunch of things called gaper clams. And you can see the big spouts, and basically clams have an in spout and an out spout. The mussels are slightly less complicated. They just basically bring the water in and pump it out. They have this incredibly strong, what we call byssal threads that bind them to the rocks. They go through a sexual spawning in the spring, a few years old. You may have seen the really, really big mussels. Those are the California mussel. And everything likes to eat them. But why shouldn't we eat them for much of the year? Red tide. And again, red tide is a dinoflagellate. It's a microscopic alga that goes into a massive breeding or bloom, and they have a toxin which gives what we call paralytic shellfish poisoning. And these guys, because they filter so much of that stuff, basically end up concentrating it. And that's why they say the months that don't have an R in them are not good for eating shellfish. But also you may have seen pictures of clams with a big X through them around our coast. That's often because there's sewage around, so that's another reason. Parks Canada has a policy that they never want to say that shellfish are safe to eat. So in all the national parks and park reserves, there's no shellfish opening, so to speak. Lots of crabs, and probably the most common familiar mid-tide zone is the purple short crab, and there's the red rock crab, which has the hardest bite that I've ever experienced as a crab. And this guy over here, the decorator crab, is really cool because it actually plants seaweeds on its legs and decorates itself. If you're paddling by bull kelp, be on the lookout for kelp crabs. Guess what color they are? They're exactly the same color as the kelp, and unless you're looking for them, you won't see them. But they are very much there. There's a porcelain crab which has one claw, they kind of have flat claws, and one's much bigger than the other. And of course the hermit crab in a periwinkle shell. And a few lifestyle notes about crabs. Some of them eat algae, but most of them eat clams and crustaceans, dead and dying stuff. And who eats them? Birds, crabs, octopus, dogfish, halibut, and people, especially the Dungeness crab. And they reproduce. They're males and female crabs. Do you all know how to tell male from female crabs? Basically, this here it's got a round plate underneath it. It's a female, and that's for holding the eggs. The male has a pointy one because it doesn't need to hold eggs, and makes it easy to identify them. And that's why in BC and many other parts of the world, they're able to say you can only harvest male crabs. And a legal male Dungeness crab is about 5 years old. So they will have already spawned several times before they're legal size. And this is a crab larva. This is what a crab larvae looks like. If you go to Banfield and do their marine science course, which is where I used to take my students to, you see these in the plankton, and they're just like these amazingly alien-looking creatures. You can see that's pretty decent size. That's like 10 millimeters long. For me, one of the most amazing things about crabs is that they can molt. And if you can imagine walking completely out of your skin to get bigger, that's what a crab does. So how does a crab, which has a hard outer skeleton, it basically, literally walks out backwards. This is a Dungeness crab walking out backwards from its shell. Basically, they kind of glop themselves onto a rock or something, and their old shell basically grabs on. They split around the middle of their base of their back, and they kind of just walk out the back. And when they come out, they're soft, and they have to hide. And you can see here, this is not a dead crab. Most of the dead crabs that you see on the beach are actually molts. If you pick it up and it's heavy and it stinks, put it down, it's dead crab. But if it's light and you can actually see The empty eye sockets and in between all the muscles is empty. It's a molt. And all the shrimp and all the crustaceans, that's how they grow. Lobsters all grow that way. They basically, when they grow, they can regrow limbs, but that's also how they get bigger. They get about 25% bigger every molt. So it's quite a big change.
How long does it take to harden this new shell?
A few days, so for it to harden. So the whole process pre actually walking out is 2 to 3 weeks. There's 2 to 3 weeks of sort of internal biochemistry that's going on where they're kind of absorbing some of the outer shell, creating the new shell material inside, and then when they're ready, they actually walk out. And then within a few days of hiding, they get hard again. I remember this happened in my classroom once where I had a red rock crab in a tank, and came in one day and there was a dead crab in my tank. And I thought, what the heck? And then I went and took it out and it was empty. And there was no crab to be seen. It was like, where did this thing go? Came back 2 days later, the crab was there and it was bigger. He'd just
How
been
frequently do they molt?
when they're in their first year or so, several times a year, 4 or 5 times a year. By the time they get to about legal size, it's about once a year. But it does vary with the species. But Dungeness, that's the story there.
How is ocean acidification affecting that?
I don't know. I'm sure that because there's calcium in the shell, that it's having some effect on it.
It's affecting the oysters,
Yeah.
especially largest.
So because I love the Galapagos, I had to show you something from Galapagos, but this was a Sally Lightfoot crab that I found on a walk last December, I'm sure maybe about this time last year. And I was just walking along the shore and I saw this crab scuttling away from this crab. And I was wondering what the heck was happening. I looked at this one closer, and I looked at it closer, and it had this kind of classic pose. Can you see how the legs are all sort of...
Yeah.
Ah.
And for me, that was the giveaway that it was a molt, just by the way it was set up. And then you can start to look here, and you can see kind of the backs falling down here. And here you can see the eyes are completely empty. And so inside of that, the entire crab had walked out. And it's just, I think it's one of the most amazing things in nature. A few more crustaceans. You may have seen these isopods, as they're called. Isopods are kind of a marine pill bug. I just love the name of this one here, Idotea wozniansky. It's also called Wozniansky's isopod. But it likes to live on rockweed, and it's kind of this greeny brown color. There's another isopod that looks just like a pill bug, but it's marine. And of course, the various shrimp that we can get around here. And these guys are primarily herbivorous, detritivores, and these guys are primarily carnivores.
I see there's the MLS after all of these. What
Yeah,
is that?
medium, low, and sub. So this is, you can find these guys in mid, low, and subtidal zones. Yeah, that's a great point. Whereas the dock shrimp is only low and sub. Okay, sponges are also cool because they're such a simple animal. They are an animal. How do they feed? Suck water in, push it out. Get the food in between. And basically sponges have these in-current things here. Basically brings the water into the colony and then it comes out through the body and gets filtered out there. And
Sorry, did you say brings it into the colony?
well, yeah, so this is a colonial, well,
Like coral?
yes and no. It's a group of cells working together, and sponges are right at the boundary of what we call multicellular life. And some people would argue that they are a colonial organism, but it's actually more of a multicellular organism. So calling it a colony wasn't completely correct. But they are so, what's the word, on the borderline of being non-multicellular that you could actually take sponges, disintegrate a sponge, take 2 different sponges, 2 different species, disintegrate them. Biologists do this in a blender. And you pour the blended mix into an aquarium, and within a matter of days, the different sponges have re-aggregated together. They have enough of a, what's the word I'm looking for, the system we use to protect our immune system. They have enough of an immune response that they're able to recognize the cells of their own species. And so, yeah. But it's kind of like, that's why we think of sponges. Sponges are considered to be one of the most primitive of the animal kingdom.
They survive a blender. They survive
They can survive a
blenders.
blender.
That sounds like, is that primitive?
They've been around for a while. It's a great trick.
What do you use the blender for after?
Yeah.
Frogs can't do that.
Yeah. A few others. Lots of worms. There are dozens of species of worms. Some of the most common ones, I think, these feather duster tube worms. Have you ever been on a dock and looked at these kind of purple, like palm trees that are coming out of the dock? Those are tube worms, and they're actually, again, filter feeding or catching stuff in the plankton. These are the calcareous tube worms. You'll often see these little white kind of squiggly things globbed on the rock, and that's the tube of a tube worm. And sometimes they have a living thing inside them, sometimes they don't. But when you see these kind of little white, what I call, they're often somewhat helical, but they often go kind of wandery, squiggly. I haven't talked much about vertebrates because in the intertidal zone there aren't very many, but there is the tide pool sculpin, and kids love to go chasing tide pool sculpins. They're incredibly good at camouflaging themselves and just sitting there waiting in a tide pool or in the low tide edge, waiting for something suitable to go by, and then eat. Okay, so my last little section here is, according to the Globe and Mail, we are like the seaweed capital of the world. Victoria is home to some of the purest seaweed in the world. With its reputation as the mild-mannered, tea-sipping, most British city in Canada, who knew that Victoria was secretly the hotbed of laminaria-loving algae aficionados? Thanks to the cold, clean waters around Vancouver Island, Victoria is home to some of the world's purest seaweed, a superfood that offers an incredible range of minerals, vitamins, and iron. A little hyperbole there. But it's actually not so much Victoria as Souk, which is, I think, where a lot of the seaweed harvesting is done. But we do have, again, very good seaweed, and the water around here is very good, very clean, and the seaweeds do have a lot of, in spite of the sewage, that's a whole other story that I don't even get me there. I want to waste some money. Anyway, the minerals, vitamins, iron are in lots of seaweeds, but the browns have nothing worth eating in them, other than the minerals. Here's a few seaweed businesses out there. There's a seaweed lady out of Souk, and then there's BC Kelp in Prince Rupert, and there's Edible Seaweed Victoria. You can go to these websites and see all the stuff that they have for offer. Some of them are offering kind of creams and skincare products, and some of them are doing it for food. You can also go to Costco and buy the Korean seaweed flakes. So it's basically dried sea lettuce, pretty much.
So we had a Japanese chef come visit us.
Yeah.
And I took them down to Telegraph Cove to
Yeah.
show them around. And they were plucking seaweed out of the water and tasting it. And
Yep. And most of the reds and greens are edible, and they don't actually taste that bad. So.
Did somebody make a seaweed beer?
Tofino has a kelp stout.
Kelp.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the recent trips I was doing for Maple Leaf Adventures was called the Craft Beer Cruise, and we had.
Oh, I know I couldn't afford that one. I would have loved
Anyway,
it,
it's,
yeah.
I've been doing trips for them for years now, and I got to do that this year.
Did you get to
I was the naturalist on the beer cruise, which means
Yes.
I just had to take hungover people on walks in the morning.
Did you have any kelp stout?
I did. It was very good.
It was good, eh?
It just tasted like a good stout.
Yeah.
Like I couldn't taste the kelp in it, but,
No.
which is probably a good thing.
Yeah.
And here's another site, Northern Bushcraft Seaweed. And again, it says all seaweed is edible, and again, edible meaning that you can eat it and it will go inside your body and stuff will happen to it, but not all of it is very nutritious. And basically the bull kelp, the giant kelp, and the alaria, the seersucker, those are brown kelps, and they really have no carbohydrates that you can digest, but they still can be seasoning, food wrapping, which is I guess another use for it, right? You know, wrap your sushi or something, and a source of fiber and vitamins. However, they can concentrate stuff. So do you want to be eating seaweeds out of Victoria Harbour or Seattle or Puget Sound or Vancouver Harbour? Probably not. And again, don't harvest stuff that's just washed up on the shore in the last storm. It's probably not so
Put it
good.
on your garden instead. Put it on your garden instead.
Yeah, put it in your garden. Here are a list of harvestable species. I didn't put this in the I didn't put that in the list on the sheet, but you can get that from the this is still on the PowerPoint on the web. So again, common ones, you know, bull kelp and giant kelp we talked about, really not particularly digestible, but you can make pickles and stuff out of them. Nice and crunchy. Eelgrass is actually a true plant as opposed to an algae, so it's actually not surprising that it's actually edible. This is a red seaweed, sea lettuce. Everybody's familiar with sea lettuce. It's that super thin green stuff on the shore, and it is quite edible.
Mike, you haven't covered sea asparagus.
Sea asparagus. So that's good. We don't get much of it around here. Get lots of it up around the Broughtons and Haida Gwaii and the Central Coast. Further up the island, yeah. So sea asparagus is again, and that's pretty much of a splash zone or high tide species. You only see that in the estuaries, river estuaries that are literally, basically you don't put your tent in the sea asparagus. Unless it's a really neat tide, you're going to get flooding. But yes, sea asparagus is definitely probably the seaweed that I've eaten the most of. And sea asparagus is technically a land plant that is sort of making its way into the ocean kind of thing. It's surviving immersion or regular immersion. And again, washed and it's really nicely crunchy and it's great.
Is there a difference between the Japanese sea lettuce, the import, and the native stuff, as far as nutrition?
I have no idea. No, I don't think, if it's sea lettuce, it's sea lettuce. It's all the species.
I was there with an actress a few years ago, and they were showing a difference of the Japanese one, which is coming in from the ships clearing their, what do you call it?
Ballast tanks?
Bills.
Yeah.
And it's actually, from what I could gather, is kind of more numerous than the native stuff.
Yeah. Look, I don't know the answer to that one. And this is from Eat magazine. So seaweeds on the Victoria, Vancouver Island coast are gaining attention. 530 macroalgae species. That's just a fancy word for saying seaweeds. Seaweeds are macroalgae, macro meaning kind of visible algae as opposed to the microalgae that you can't see. And 650,000 tons of wild kelp, which we don't harvest. Yeah, there we go. These are taken from a seaweed seller's site. So, do I harvest a lot of seaweed myself? No, but I'm quite happy to eat sea lettuce in clean water, and I do harvest bull kelp periodically for making pickles. It's kind of fun, kind of crunchy. And I have not made a seaweed smoothie. I don't really intend to. Okay. On to a few resources. I think I've got a few minutes here to talk about a few resources. So, first of all, I wanted to talk about a few apps. And I think probably one of the most important apps to have is something to figure out the tides with. And I've got, because I'm an Android user, I've got the Android apps there. And then let's see if I can get this to work. Where's the Gizmo?
Do any of these work without,
So the most important thing in my mind in getting an app, and these are, by the way, all on the sheet. These are all listed, the links are all on the sheet. The most important thing is find one that does not need the internet. And if you notice, I've put Tides near me, which is usually the first one that comes up in the list. It needs the internet. Don't get it. Well, it's fine to have it when you have the internet, but all of the other ones, you don't need the internet. And let me just go, JTides for a Windows or Mac computer is fine. Let's see if I can get this too. Okay. Okay, oh shoot, I have to forgotten how to do this. Okay, my new phone, I haven't quite figured out how to. That's better. Okay, so if I go to Marine, and then I go to, probably one of my favorite ones is this guy called Fly to Map. This is for Android. And I can scroll along and see the same. This is the Victoria tides for today. You can kind of go a few days ahead and see how it's changing. Shows you the sun and the moon phases down below. What else have I got in here? I've got the tides near me is I wouldn't bother. I like this one, tide prediction. So I can go search by location. It tells me the closest one. So let's just go to Infinity Cove, and you'll notice Infinity Cove it's got a pretty straightforward tide chart, and you can see kind of how it's changing over time, right? And what was the other one? The other one that I like is this one, which is called Tides. Well, actually, I just got a new phone this week, so I'm still getting my apps together. This is quite a nice one, and I think, if I turn it sideways, no, it doesn't change it. And I think if I go with this one, it's kind of cool, because this, if I click on that little button, you can see how it's going from neaps to springs. It's showing you the range. So 2 days ago, November 5th, or whatever it was, no, on November 5th would have been the lowest tide. And what else? If I go back to here, okay.
Put that up for a second, I want to take a picture of it.
Oh, which one?
This, yeah.
it's on your sheet.
It's right on here? So-
Yeah.
It's on the sheet. Yeah, these next few pages are entirely on my sheet.
Oh, okay,
Okay. So this is probably my favorite app for a Windows PC. And what can I do here? I'm going to figure out how this goes right. So that's working now, and if I go to I just have that. Yeah, so there's Port Renfrew's tides, and again, this is kind of a nice PC program that does a good job. And then
What's the difference in the colors?
so basically, green and blue is rising and falling tides. Yellow and blue is night and day.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
It was actually kind of neat when I was up in the Arctic this summer. wasn't any of this stuff.
What do you like for currents? What do you like for currents?
I use this one for currents as well.
There's only so many current stations.
Yeah, it only does the major ones, but if I go and take out the checkbox for there, it'll just give me, let's go down to raised passage, so you can see the raised passage current graphs. And so it's, yeah, I haven't found anything that does the secondary current stations as an app. I've seen lots that do all the primary ones.
You got
Which
what
slide
really
was
bugs
this?
me is that you've got
Yeah,
raised
it's the
rocks,
same, isn't it?
pillar point, and flattery.
But if you go actually, this is J-Tides, and it basically works the same on.
Which one were you using before?
It was called WX Tide, and that's a Windows only, right? J-Tides works with basically everything. Oh, I'm getting ready for my next trip, and I wanted to figure out what the tides were going to be like in Antarctica.
Oh.
And, if I go to Bamfield, it's a little closer to home, so you can see. So J-Tides has nighttime, daytime, and dusk. Twilight. And it's got some nice little features. You can go and play with the zoom, you can see here. Then eventually you zoom so far that it shows you kind of a weird graph where the white is the low and the brown is the high or something like that. Anyway, it's, I prefer, I find I use WX Tide more, but I know that J-Tides is Mac and Windows available, so it's good to have that. Sure. Okay. The Tides websites that I put there. Oh, sorry. For iOS, if you're using an iPhone-y thing, iTides is probably AYE Tides is probably the best app for iPhones, I think. Anybody else who's an iPhone
Does
user?
that require internet?
No, doesn't require the internet. The only ones that I put, the only ones on this list that use the internet, and the reason I put it up there was because it uses the internet. I wanted to remind myself to tell you not to use that.
Okay.
Okay, so Tides Near Me uses the internet. So it doesn't use, yeah, it uses the internet and doesn't work without it. Okay, where did I get to? Okay, let's go back here. Okay, and I covered all that. Yeah, so there's lots of good apps, and say having a Tides app on your phone is so easy, and it's just great to have it because you've got, and most of these things, and they work all over the world. The Tide station data is pretty much global. Some ID sheets, and I've got again a list of this, but there are some books. Welks to Whales is a great book on just learning about all the different cool things that you can find. I highly recommend that one. There's Ian Sheldon's Seashore of BC. I'll have these left up here. If you want something that you can kind of keep in a bag handy, there are all these different British Columbia seashore life, and there are little other ones, birds and other things. There's a few other more detailed ones like Sea Stars of BC, or actually the Pacific Northwest. And so the nice thing is that if it says Pacific Northwest, it basically covers here pretty well. And then there's seaweeds. I think these are Harbor Publishing. Yeah, Harbor Publishing. And if you really want to learn a lot about seaweeds, Louis Druel's Pacific Seaweeds is the book. He has a seaweed farm up in Bamfield and has written kind of the Bible of West Coast Pacific Northwest seaweeds. Tide sites. I'm just going to try this because I think I have the internet. Didn't have the internet. Let's go to. Actually, maybe I can try and go to the link in my presentation. Other thing to do. here. Okay. So if I go to here, let's see what this does. Oh, this is a link to get to the Tides Near Me site, which is, again, the one that I don't recommend unless you have, it works fine around Victoria if you've got cell data, but you need data to cover that one. The other one that I think is much better is this guy, these next two. So it comes to, by default, it comes to Puget Sound at Seattle. You can then go and find the other stations here. You can go and find your
Showing for us.
Oh, yeah, okay. Thank you, I will put that back. And what I need to do is, I need to figure out how to, I need to force, PowerPoint likes to take over your screen and extend it. So I'll go back up to here. Still do that, okay? Okay, and let's see if that works now. That's better, isn't it? Yeah. So this is showing you Seattle, and then I can click on other tide stations and find Victoria Harbor. So basically it's kind of focused on our area, the West Coast. And then the other one, I'm going to be careful not to click on the, actually start this one here. Oh, I have to go control click. Okay, so this one here is, we've got to select a location, so let's just type in Victoria. Oh, there's a few Victorias out there. South Carolina, Malaysia, or let's go for BC, I think. Or PEI. Okay. And you can see there, it shows you kind of the tide graph for here. So this is just a website. And this one is kind of nice because it shows you all of the other locations in a map nearby. I think it's actually clickable, but you might find that if you look at some of the American current stations, there's one here that's just off Discovery. There's actually another one down here and another one up here. So you can get a few more current sites. Those green ones are current sites.
And you just have to click on them?
I'm about to find out. Oh, let's do it. No.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, better and better.
Not clickable, but I can scroll and find it because I saw its name.
Yeah, see, there's current, tide, current,
Yeah.
you go down that list.
Yeah, so you can pick those. So it does have multiple tide and current stations. And then going back here, we got diversity. Okay, the next few links are basically more sites on diversity. The Central Coast Diversity Marine Animal Site is like everything you could possibly want to know about the species that live on this coast in the Intertidal. It's an excellent site. But I also, before I forget, I skipped over and didn't show you, was these are, I think, really handy sheets that you can get as a kayaker. These are produced by Periwinkle Press. I wonder where they got the name from. And they are common intertidal invertebrates of the Salish Sea, which is Point of Fuca, Puget Sound, Strait of Georgia. And then this one is the common intertidal seaweeds and seagrasses. You'll notice they have one page for the green ones, one page for the red ones, and one for the brown ones. And then here, they've kind of got everything in what we call phylogenetic order, starting from the simple guys, the sponges, the anemones, and then it's got worms, and then all kinds of mollusks, pages of mollusks, there's a lot of them.
They're all waterproof, aren't they?
Hmm?
They're waterproof?
Yes, they're laminated and waterproof. Now, what I was going to say is that if people are interested in getting some of these, I can order these. I can get an educator's price on these. And when I did this for the Intertidal paddle the last couple of years, I gathered a few names and we just ordered them. What I can do is maybe, Barbara, do you have an email list of everybody in the group?
Yes, I do.
Okay, what I may do is I can get you to send out the information once I remember. I can't remember exactly what they cost last time I got them, but they were something like, I'm thinking like they were $15 for the, it might have been $15 for the plant set and $20 for the animal set, or slightly less than that, and that was after shipping and exchange and all kinds of stuff for the exchange. But it comes from Periwinkle Press, and if I go back up here, what else? So, actually, why did I just go in here and see if I can find that? Here we go. So you can see here, it kind of shows you little pictures of the, I think they've got one side that's actually a clickable link. You can see the whole thing. Right, so that's the wormy page. Aren't they gorgeous? Oh, those cool colors. And you can see the kind of the 8 sides. And there's 230 species. And it probably says somewhere how to order them. I don't remember where we got them from. I have an email that I used to order them. I can't remember where they were. Let's say, I'm not a very good sales pitch here. But anyway, there's no buy now button, right?
Oak Harbor one.
Yeah, Oak Harbor?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. But they don't take that long to get, and I've ordered them kind of a few sets every year. But what I can do is maybe get Barbara to send out a list, and anybody, or
Actually,
What-
you could send
what-
it out to the whole,
Yeah.
whole club. You know,
Sure,
the
let me do
big-
that.
the Really big order,
Yep,
because I'm sure there'll be
okay, yeah, I can do that too.
really numbers.
But I think that's, yeah, I can do that, and then people can get those. 'Cause I find that these are great to have, like, after my charts, I take these guys. Right? I don't have anything, these are my class set I take when I'm doing clinics and if I'm doing like a paddle, I would bring these with me. But and these are. What else? Oh, and then the last. The last link on your thing is the link to the talk and the online version of the presentation and resources. So I think that's my last slide. So anyway, I think hopefully I have given you a pretty good idea of what's out there and how it works and why it's weird and kind of wonderful. Happy to stay around and answer questions. I don't know what time we have to be out of here, Barbara. Right? 9 o'clock? Edgar has some things to say. Yes.
Oh, just quickly, next Tuesday night, not this Tuesday, the following Tuesday, we're doing a VHF course and it's geared for kayakers. And we go through the VHF radio, some of the features, but particularly we go through the scenarios that kayakers may find themselves in.